Welcome very much to Conversations, where I'm pleased to welcome to the program Dr. Herbert Schiller. And Dr. Schiller is, well, he's based and has been based over the more recent history at the University of California at San Diego in the Department of Communications. And he had taken academic work in economics and is an inspiration to many people who are concerned with economic development, and particularly the democratization of communications, if I may say so. And Dr. Schiller, welcome very, very much to Conversations and to Manhattan Network.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
I wonder if I just gave a little bit of an outline there. Maybe you could fill it in a little bit more appropriately and so forth. We want to talk about communication, particularly alternative communication. Maybe you could share a little bit of your own background to sort of anchor it here for us.
Yeah, well, I'm originally from New York City, which I think is immediately distinguishable.
Yes.
And I have all of my formal education in New York City. I went as an undergraduate to, at the time, CCNY.
Right.
From there I had a MA in economics at Columbia, and then a PhD in economics at NYU.
And
it was all in New York.
Yeah, right.
And then I taught originally, after I had all of those credentials, or even while I was getting them, I taught at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and also at City College downtown and uptown as well. So
were you teaching economics then in those early stages?
Yes, in those early stages I was teaching economics, although at Pratt I was also teaching a much more general kind of social studies.
Did you have a, if I may, I don't want to put, you know, were you always in a certain sense sort of comprehensively involved in a lot of interdisciplinary thinking?
Yes,
or did you pretty much get involved in the nuts and bolts of economic theorizing?
No, in fact, that's what led me out of economics, because I found that I was, at least as I viewed it, too restricted in terms of what economics is all about, or at least the way it's practiced and the way it's written and taught. So I was able to make a transition from my earlier work in economics to this more general area of communications, and that occurred when I was at the University of Illinois after I left New York, and that was sometime toward the end of the 1960s. And so I was at Illinois until the end of the 60s, and at that time I moved out to the University of California. I've been there since 1970. I started the program in communications at my university. Now it's a department. Originally it was a much more modest arrangement.
Yes.
And that's what I've been working on, doing my teaching and lecturing and writing on mostly the character of the communication system in the United States and how that impinges on the world at large.
It's important increasingly because, you know, people will say we're coming into a into a world of I don't know, post-industrial or whatever, but some people say we're coming into an informational environment, and the information as a factor in economics, they have it has a new importance in terms of understanding economics, but also just the social, the onward development of the societies. Understanding these new information technologies is more important than perhaps it has been in the past.
Well, if nothing else, it's now a central part of the economy, whereas in the past you would say this was on the fringes. Now it's right in the center. In terms of, for example, the actually heart of economics, and where does the capital go, what kind of investment? Today, a huge amount of that capital goes into high-tech technology and information technology. So you're dealing with what is now the central part of the system. Now, of course, it's not just investment, it's what's done with this investment, the kinds of content, the kinds of data, the kinds of messages, the kinds of information that flow through this system, what are their impacts, who benefits from them, who uses them, and how this then moves out into the global arena. Those are the areas that I find very, very challenging.
Yeah, there was a man, is it Yuri Mark Perard, I think, who wrote a study back in the 70s on trying to quantify the movement into the information. That was a pretty seminal study and a pretty seminal idea that the information was becoming more and more relevant to economics understanding than it had been in the past. And that was just about the time that you were beginning to move into the development of a communications department that, from a basis of from a basic grounding in economics. So you were right,
Yes.
in a certain sense, moving with the times.
Well, at least it's come out that way.
Yes.
When I was doing it, I wasn't in any way tailoring my movements toward what I thought would happen. It just was an area which I thought had greater and greater value in explaining so much of what was going on in the society. And I think that has been the case. The whole communications process today is really part and parcel of the power base of this society.
Okay.
And who has access to that infrastructure, who is able to utilize that infrastructure, and for what reasons, these are the crucial questions, I would say.
Yeah, they are crucial. And do you think that we need to have some sort of a new way of addressing this? That that we don't have a we have a Department of State, we have a Department of well, we did have an Office of Telecommunications within the federal structure, and that sort of thing, or in general understanding. Do we give a sufficient? I mean, Mr. Gore and some of our political leaders are trying to talk about the importance of the superhighway and trying to bring these things into account. But do you think? I wonder if it's been given sufficient attention in the order in which it deserves.
Well, what I would look at it this way, I think there are various units in the government that handle it, such as the Federal Communications Commission,
that's true,
things like that. But the really important and unaddressed question is, how does the public play a role in all of this? Because what we have been seeing on a very, very large scale has been the really big participants, the major actors, have been large-scale companies.
Yeah.
You see. And they have been drafting the legislation, or at least having a huge part in the drafting of the legislation. And tremendous kinds of developments have sort of just sailed past with practically no discussion in our society. Yeah. I mean, I don't mean to say nothing at all, but no really what you would call significant debate. Some of the most major issues. Let me just give you one example. There are many.
Yes.
But last year they passed what they call the Telecommunications Reform Bill, and 1996.
Yes.
Now that bill has been instrumental in changing the fundamental structure of the industry, and there was really practically no discussion about that.
There wasn't.
No,
there are normal hearings and so forth,
but even in
sufficient.
Congress, the bill was 1,000 pages. You couldn't expect more than a couple of the Congress people to even have looked at the bill.
Even their staff.
Right. So it went through. But as a result of that bill, we have had actually an orgy of mergers and consolidations. Not that we haven't had large-scale combinations in the field of communications before this, but this was sort of like a green light, and it opened up the door. So we are faced today with gargantuan corporate structures, and what the impact of these will be, and what this means for citizen involvement, what this means for being able to determine so many of these crucial questions. That's something that's just been passed by at this point.
Yeah. Was that the Communications Act of '96? Was that, to, in a certain sense, supplement, or what was its relationship to the basic grounding policy statement of the Communications Act of 1934? Could you set those is it on that level that they were trying to take a
Well,
purview
very
of
much so,
things?
very
And
much so.
That's a huge lot to bite off, particularly in these times, right?
But you see, the 1934 Act, which actually established the Federal Communications Commission, came out of a very different kind of a social atmosphere.
Yes, right.
And in that particular time, there were still very, very powerful social currents in the United States who felt, for example, that broadcasting should not be exclusively a private entity, that it should have a tremendous public input, that there should be, let us say, the non-commercial sector, the municipalities, the academic areas, and all of that. And there was some of that, of course, but so the early measures that came out of the 1934 time were, I would say, much more cognizant of the public need, the public relationship to communications. And in fact, that very famous expression, the airwaves belong to the people.
Yeah,
That's sort of a generalized statement. That's indicative of that era.
Yeah, that was coming out of that era where the government's role and the people's role, in the sense of the name of the government, coming off the Depression years and so forth, there was a different kind of context than what seems to be gestating now. Ben Bagdikian has written well, hasn't he, on the concentration of power, as it were, within the communications industry.
He started off several years ago with his book, The Media Monopoly.
Yes.
It just came out in his 5th edition.
Good for him. Yeah.
And but what the findings are, what are interesting, is he said, well, he started out the industry and the whole field of communications and the broadcasting and the media, all that were run by not very many people, but you could put them, you would say, in a small room. He says now, when he calculates what's happened, you could put them in a broom closet. So,
of that room, yes.
Yeah. So that gives you some idea of the enormous concentration that's occurred.
Yeah, and that's been encouraged, you would say, by the Communications Act of '96, even though wasn't one of the main charges of that to try and encourage deregulation in the name of creating greater competition? Wasn't that the rationale? You don't see that happening?
Well, you can verify that for yourself. You go around. Do you find cable prices coming down?
No.
Do you find telephone prices coming down? You, in fact, have heard just very recently now that if you want to call from one of the street corner booths, the prices are going up. And that's just one small example. But no, there has been no manifest increase in competition, but there has been a very, very clear-cut increase in the size of the units and the reduction of the number of units. And of course, then we get some new kinds of theories that come along to justify or rationalize these things. Yeah. And one of the theories that I've come across is, well, you can have more competition with fewer. Now, that's a very curious kind of a conception, but nevertheless.
Well, if you get a few down there, it's like the OK Corral or something. You get a few down there who can really draw fast or really tough. They can compete with each other, whereas if you had a great number of small ones, they couldn't compete effectively against one big guy. I guess that's the thinking, or
well, I don't know. I would regard it more as rationalization, or apologetics. We've got so many examples of how when you get just a few big players, they don't really go, head-to-head or toe-to-toe. They make deals, because each one, has a very, very big turf to defend.
Yes.
They don't want any unstable conditions. Right. They don't want anything that's going to make things very, unclear what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think the last thing in the world that a real well-to-do and well-established capitalist, the head of a large corporation, wants is surprises.
Exactly.
Entrepreneurial sense. Enough of that.
Well, like
they've got a lot of profit centers to run.
So, like for example, here in the communications sector, there were a couple of local examples, where Time Warner and Fox under Murdoch, had a dispute, and that was being played up that they were going to really have a big slam bang battle. They didn't. They resolved it very simply.
Well, Fox was now out in New York, on another channel and so forth. But these things are all developed. And you developed an interest out of your, if I may, back again to your academic thing, Urbana, or was it Urbana where you were?
Urbana, where I first started.
Right. But can you remember what it was that led you to take an interest in, let's say, just from economics, which you were, and to take account of the importance of communications? Because you have, if I may say, a singularly important role in terms of helping to point the right way for a whole lot of people to become interested in that. D.D. Halleck and a lot of others have been your students, and just when did you get the idea that this was a course you wanted to follow?
Well, it came, I would say not automatically, but more or less flowing out of my view of what economics should be about.
Okay.
And that was a subject that was should be examining the sources of power and how that power was used in the distribution of a society's resources, who gets what and on what basis, and are there impediments to what you would call a more equitable distribution. So those were concerns that I had in my earliest kinds of interests. And it became increasingly clear to me, for a variety of reasons, that this subject could be better approached, or at least more understandably approached in terms of explaining what was going on, by looking at the area of the mass media and communications, and where these messages were coming from, who were producing these messages, what was being said in these messages, and what kind of an effect did these messages have. And so that sort of was the transitional arrangements.
You sort of intuitively figured. Well, if I may, if you've had a great deal to say that would want to try and encourage a democratization and the access of people that have perhaps been left out in the normal pattern. Have you had that sort of sense of the social responsibility or the way you see society for a considerable part of your life? You've been concerned with the people who, in a certain sense, had been marginalized by the big players, as we say.
Well, you know, a lot of these things come out of your own personal experiences.
Sure, right. Yeah.
And I guess I'm now one of a smaller and smaller band of people who had some of their life experiences very, very deeply affected by the big depression in the United States in the 30s. Now, I was still a young person, but I couldn't help but feel what was going on in terms of how that affected my own family. You know, so that
was a real trauma that is hard for people to understand.
Powerful conditioning factor, and I would say that's been something that's been with me all the time.
Right, and it might be well for a number of people who perhaps haven't adequately learned that we want to try and do everything that we possibly can to avoid such in the future, and that to be cognizant of some of the social things that we learned coming out of that. A lot of people feel we're moving away from those safety net and other kinds of provisions that were made, much less even government's responsibility for, in the name of the people, and of creating equitable situations that are long-term beneficial. But this idea of deregulation and the country's changed considerably since the last 10 years or so, hasn't it?
Well, I'd say it's been gradual, but certainly ever since 1980, with the first Reagan administration, has been a really big shift in terms of these matters. And deregulation, as I understand it, and when I talk about it, I regard that as a code word. And a code word which really means the stripping away of accountability from the private sector, that they are less and less subject to any type of oversight, any type of monitoring from the point of view of the public. And also in this whole period, and this relates to both economics and communications, I believe there's been just an absolutely monumental shift in terms of identifying who are the sinister forces in the society. And there has been, I would say, an extremely successful campaign to make people believe, I can't say it's been totally successful, but to make people believe that their greatest enemy and adversary is the government.
It's amazing how successful they have been.
To have argued that way 50 years ago would have been ludicrous. You'd have been ludicrous. You'd have been just absolutely regarded as someone who had no understanding of what was going on. And almost all of the measures that have made our society at least minimally tolerable, you know, such as the unemployment insurance, such as the Social Security system, such as some of the support of the arts and sciences, all of these came about from this view of the necessity to have a role for the, whatever you want to call it, the state, the government, where the market society is not going to be able to carry out what is needed for the larger popular base. And that has been somewhat swept aside.
You know, it's very interesting. A lot of the people who argued against it, Mr. Reagan and others, some of the supply side and so forth, who would argue against the state being involved in the economy, let's just say you were in economics and so forth, they would have argued, or let's say in a socialist, or let's say an all-out communist kind of Marxian critique of things, they would have seen the institution of private property itself as the vehicle for creating inequitable distribution or ownership of wealth and so forth. And so they would critique it, and they would say, let's do away with private property as an institution, create a state where all the power of the economic planning and so forth is in the hands of the state, in the communist system and so forth. And so that, you know, that's the direction that they went. That, in a certain sense, in the minds of many, it still lingers in other aspects, and there's shades of gray and so forth. But that was overthrown, in a certain sense, in 1989 when the Soviet Union came apart, in the minds of many. But now there's some people who are saying, George Soros and others, they say it's no longer some sort of a socialist threat. It's the unfettered, complete giving of power into a laissez-faire capital, all power to capital and corporations is the greatest threat to democratic or open society possibilities that we have. And it's sort of an interesting thing. These things are washing back and forth, and yet there's still people who will be saying, they'll still try and make people believe that big government is the only source of tyranny. They don't talk very much about the possibility of big corporate bureaucratic power that could be exerted on people, and perhaps they ought to more than they have.
Well, I would say so, but
Yeah.
before we get on to that,
those are big
I
themes,
would also say, you see, that the notion of having a social governance of the society's output didn't rest on the formation of the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution. Obviously, that embodied it, but the United States has a long tradition that preceded the Russian Revolution of very, very substantial groups and movements that felt that life would be more democratic and life would be more healthy if the power of concentrated wealth was checked and in many cases limited. We have these movements that occurred all throughout the 19th century into the 20th century, well preceding the Russian Revolution. So that's very important. You know, all of these ideas were not imported. It's not like there was an infection that occurred,
metastasized.
In this society. And of course, none of this can be exercised forever, because the basic questions remain. The basic questions remain are the quality of life for the majority of the population. And if that quality of life is not sustained or begins to deteriorate, all of the issues which, say, in the last 25 or 30 years have been pushed aside, they'll all return. They're not going to disappear.
Yeah, well, I was taking reference to an article Mr. Kaplan had in the Atlantic Monthly now and so forth, but there's some people who say that now we're going globalization, we're going into a globalized economy, and that power is increasingly being held, not so much, even the governmental units are not the powers that they have been traditionally, that all the power in terms of operating this planet, this system, is going into the hands of corporations that are getting very large, and they're getting very, very much of a global purview that they have. These communications corporations you were talking about are very big, and that the power, the ability of government agencies or of the people through their government agencies to have an effective check on corporate power is eroding all the time, even at the national level, and that's a threat to democracy as we think of it.
Well, for most of the countries in the world, and there are about 200 countries, the process that you've described has already occurred.
Yes.
For most of the countries in Africa, most of the countries in Latin America, their governments are totally incapable of dealing with the power of this transnational corporate system, which can move its funds back and forth, which can make decisions on whether or not they will expand production or reduce production, in fact, even curtail totally that production. So what would in the old days be called national sovereignty has been very, very much limited. Now, of course, it has been limited depending on how strong the nation was to begin with. Now, in the United States, there are some limitations on the sovereignty, but this is the strongest nation at this time. And so it throws its weight around a great deal, and you would be hard-pressed to say its autonomy was limited. But once you get away from the United States, you're in another area where most of these countries are increasingly dependent and increasingly, I would say, at the mercy of this large corporate force. To take a look at Korea today, here a few months ago they were talking about, these, indefatigable Asian tigers. Well, all these tigers seem to suddenly have been defanged.
Well, as we talk now, the end of November, there's a real currency crisis going on out of Asia. There's a lot of things that are shaking the confidence of the world in this thing. But I mean, in this, so that's a big globalization pattern. But even here in the United States, with this shift of as you put it, putting it over on people to say that the only enemy they have, let's get government off our back.
That's right.
So they would take that by cutting welfare benefits and by anything at all to the people that is going to benefit those that are disadvantaged in the society. But the corporate privatization process that's going on is more and more becoming the force in the society, and that applies within the communications industry as well, I think. Don't you?
In the communications industry, it's carried to its highest scale. You have, for example, if we just take the 4 big networks, it's remarkable. You have General Electric owning NBC, and General Electric is one of the super corporations in the world. And then you have Westinghouse owning CBS. And then you have Mr. Murdoch and his International News Corporation owning Fox. And ABC, which was also a very illustrious network, powerful network, has been bought out by Disney.
Yes. Yeah.
So look what you have. Now, some people say, well, that just means because they have that much more wealth and power, they can do more things. Well, that's true. They can do more things, but what kind of things?
Yeah, right.
And will that be a wealth and power that's used to produce the kind of diversity and variety and the total range of both creative work and political messages? That's a very different kind of a question.
What do you think?
I certainly wouldn't.
As you see things developing, how do you feel? What is your general attitude or sense of the way we're going, let's say in the realm of communications in this country?
Well, I would say we've been moving more and more toward and I know that sounds pretty harsh, but toward a more and more controlled informational condition.
Oligopic? Is that too
Well, you could call it by a very, very small number of very powerful units. But it takes many forms. For example, I've read the New York Times all my life.
Yes.
I spend my time.
We must.
Yes, that's right. And I've run around in places where it wasn't available trying to find it.
Yes, I know.
But if you look at the New York Times, and that's, let's say, the standard bearer in the country.
Yeah,
I'm not trying to be chauvinistic.
No, it just is the newspaper of record.
But look at the New York Times front page now and compare it, say, with the New York Times front page of 20 years ago, 40 years ago. And what do you see? You see more and more of what it could be called soft news.
Really? Okay, yeah.
Just, in fact, news that at another time would have been tabloid news.
Yes, right.
And you get hold of a daily edition of the paper here, and it has its now 6, 8 sections.
Yes, right.
What are these 6 or 8 sections for? Why are they there? Well, you can always justify them all. If you're interested in housing, if you're interested in architecture, if you're interested in science, all of that.
Or they have one on Monday, which you don't want to miss, the information industry. You don't want to miss that, and you got to see science on Tuesday. And
but also these sections are more and more developed to cajole advertising, to get the advertisers to put into these areas, and also to attract a certain stratum of the population, you see, which again allows the advertisers to know this is a very desirable group.
And we're in color now, do you notice now? USA was right, you know.
Yeah, well, USA, which was always regarded as Mac paper,
yes, right.
has allowed or has had most of its techniques just been taken over.
Do you think the Times is moving that way in order to boost circulation among the groups of people that they hadn't adequately got in the past?
I think so.
Is that tabloidization in a sort of way?
Well, it's tabloidization, but it's also, I think, much greater commercialization. The thing that drives all of our media, not just newspapers, of course, even more so television, is this quest for the chosen kind of either reader, viewer, listener, and that chosen person is demographically of a certain age, probably between 25 and 35. It could even be a little younger. And it's based on their age, their spending power, their lifestyles, and this is what the entire game is about.
Yeah, well, hasn't it, you did economics, hasn't it always been in a certain sense based at a certain level at that? They do have to run a business, as it were, in order to make enough to not go under. It's no good if you're not going to pay back your investments and that sort of thing.
But
it's always been there, and then they will also say in the globalization pattern, they'll also say, well, if we don't take this course of developing the mass market, somebody's going to, and we'll be out of business. We have to keep up with the market and the times. And what do we have over the years said to those kind of arguments, and what are we able to say to them now in a way that might be in any way different than what we have over the years said?
Well, first of all, it usually in the past applied to industrial production.
Yeah.
And you could raise some very serious objections about that kind of a standard or criterion there, which we may come back to. But what we're talking about here is where you have what you could call the cultural industries, the industries that are the publishing industry, the newspaper industry, the television industry, the film industry, the recording industry. When they operate according to these same kinds of criteria, what you're having is a continuous debasement of the content. So it's not quite the same that if you were Procter and Gamble and you're producing soap or detergent, and you make the box a little smaller, a little bigger, and you have a bigger D or a smaller D on your packaging. When you begin to use those techniques on people who are reading and seeing and hearing your messages, you are diverting them from what could be a much more serious kind of thought and analysis. You are giving them the most superficial and emotional kinds of stimuli. And this is being done exclusively for, as I say, commercial reasons.
And here it's getting into the actual, what would be like the substance of the product itself, which it used to be a bar of soap. This is the actual message is being treated that way as we come into where, again, the information environment that we're coming into is something new that's emerging out of the industrial era. We're coming into a new era. Do you think maybe it's a inherent development that it will go into this kind of a pattern, given the fact that information is becoming so important? And I know Professor Romer, I think a young economist now, is being lauded by many, along with Mark Perot and others who have called this attention in the economic realm. There's some people saying he's going to, at a young age, be ready for a Nobel laureate kind of status in terms of economics, because he's the importance of information as a new factor in terms of trying to understand the economy outside of just labor and capital as traditionally we have thought of the economy in traditional economic thinking.
Well, I'm not that impressed with that sort of outlook. I think the same fundaments are here and are still playing their basic role. Information is important. Obviously, it plays has a much larger place in our existence today. But I would say most of the information that's floating around is corporate information. That's the picture. You see, when you hear about the tremendous expansion of telecommunications companies, which are these big operations, you know, MCI and AT&T.
That's all intrust stuff, right?
Yeah, but what are they doing? They are, they're building their infrastructure, and that infrastructure is being used to carry the messages of the rest of the corporate system. It's not something that's being used to develop particular techniques. The 270 million people who live in the country, they will be the receivers, they will be the receptors, they will be the receptacles of what all of that stuff is all about. So another aspect of this, of course, also is when we talk about commercialization, is the whole commercialization of the concept of free speech. You know now that corporate speech has been given a great deal of constitutional protection.
Yeah, it sure has. Yeah.
Well, when you do that, you are favoring those who have the deepest pockets.
Right.
But again, it's not as in the old days, well, all right, so they can have an effect somewhere else in the economic process. That kind of speech is the kind of speech that becomes the dominant speech in the society.
Yeah.
It drowns out all the other voices.
Yeah.
And so when you asked me earlier, how do I find things moving, I'd say they're moving in ways that can create great damage to the democratic process,
Yeah.
all the way up and down the line.
Right, right. Yeah, it's a very real danger. We could still go and read some of those traditional books very well, some of Mr. Orwell's and some of Mr. Aldous Huxley and some of these other books that have stood the test of time pretty well, and they might be well worth reading again.
Well, but also the books that have analyzed the development of capitalism and its growth and its characteristics, none of this has been made obsolete, you see. It's just been, for the moment, kept on the side. And of course...
You mean by the informational environment in consideration?
Well, the whole...
The softness of information.
But not only that, but the structure of power in the society. When we came out of the Depression, if I may use the word capital, those who control the resources of the society, they're in a very defensive mood. And for the very obvious reason that the country had gone through the ringer.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even the ideology of the country had been severely tested, in the sense that where in the old days they used to say, well, anybody can succeed, and
yes, Horatio Alger.
All of that took a big beating in the 30s.
Uh-huh.
But by the time World War II was over, and then certainly after the next 10 or so years, that defensiveness of the owners of large-scale property had been overcome. And I would say, if you were going to describe this age now that we're living in, is one of almost unbridled arrogance.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting,
unwillingness.
And it's on a planetary scale.
On a planetary scale,
Yeah, right.
So it's a very, very chastening kind of a situation to see this.
Well, those who have tried to speak for the, let's say on the side of capital in a traditional way, you'd say those who represented the capital they owned the capital assets, is still relatively a small percentage of the population on an individual basis owns the capital assets of the corporate, of the system. Most people have only a labor relationship to that production, and we've been speaking for labor. Now we have a dual thing. We have first we have the globalization process, which makes it possible for, Paul Kennedy points out from Yale points out that we've got 250 million workers in North America, Europe, and even the tiger countries in Asia, and then you got a 1.5 on to 2 billion people who are ready to, and they need $90 a day or so in order to be able to maintain the standard of living. And then you've got all these people over here in Asia that are willing to work for, $2 or $3 a day, and there's going to be wage conversion. So there's going to be tremendous pressures put if they operate globally. But then you also have the economic displacement capability that seems to be functioning. We've had this downsizing that's gone on for decades now, with people that have been downsized out of career positions and management and other things they've had. So we have some really structural factors going on that are roiling the economy and the sociology of the country, and it is pretty feisty now, do you think? There's some opposition, a serious opposition that's beginning to build up at a systems level for understanding what's going on? Or is that reaching
that's
for too
still,
far?
I think, a little bit amount of overstatement. I think as these conditions deepen, and the tensions also increase, there will obviously be various forms of expression.
Yeah, there's going to be some
opposition,
discontent. Yeah, right.
No question about it.
Right.
At this stage, it seems to me, I wouldn't say muted, but basically underground.
Yes, right.
It's there.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's even reported in the general conventional media, that most people, even though they're working and maybe even doing well, have uncertainty and feelings of insecurity.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But I mean, we again, this is part of that whole wave of reconditioning people's minds. A system based on property relations, which is what ours is rooted in insecurity. It's almost by definition of that character. And it requires, even though it would be denied, it requires a very substantial part of the labor force to always be in a state of insecurity, and sometimes even without work. You see Albert Allen Greenspan.
Yeah.
He's sitting there with his finger on the trigger. You
Yeah,
say,
inflation,
when is he going to
inflation.
press the button to increase interest rates?
Yes, right.
What's he worried about? He's
Yeah.
worried about the fact that for some unexplained reasons, we have more employment than we've had in a generation. You know?
Yeah, it's down
And
4.7
this
now.
is
Yeah.
regarded as
Yeah.
a tremendous threat. But if you go back again, as I said,
Threat to the possibility of inflation.
Right,
Yeah.
but they
no
regard
sign
it,
of it anywhere.
but they regard it as a threat to the nation.
Yeah.
You see. Now, if you go back, as I was saying, to the end of World War II, a bill was passed in Congress called the Humphrey Hawkins Full
Sure.
Employment Act,
Right.
which said the goal of the society should be to have no more than 4% unemployment.
Right.
You see. So you can see this
Right.
tremendous shift that's occurred in thinking in terms of who's making the decisions and who's saying what the dangers are. So back in that period, the danger was unemployment.
Well, yeah, we were talking the Employment Act of 1946 is a basic
yeah.
grounding policy statement,
Yeah.
I think, now.
Yeah.
I'm not sure Humphrey Hawkins might have been down the line a little bit, but anyway, it was there, and it was only 4% they were saying was what we could live with, and
Now,
now
if
they
you
can't.
would talk about 4%, you know, in recent years, they look at you as if you were a lunatic.
Because we're down, what, 4.6 now or something in this
Well,
country.
it's-
But a lot of people point out you need two people to make what one person used to be able
Well,
to
of
take care
course.
of a family with.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
since about 1973, those productivity gains that they were able to do, the rises in standard of living and so forth didn't track after 1973, and they're disquieting signs that the way we've been doing things isn't going to work appropriately to the way we've been, you know, the way things are going now. That's another issue in a sense. Now this thing on communications, though, you've been particularly interested. You've been at San Diego in the Department of Communications. Is there among the young people coming along in the universities and so forth an interest in communications? We come into an informational environment. Where does it fit in terms of the academic community and academic, you know, the direction in which we're going? Do you think that the information technologies, whether they're individual websites on the internet or something like that, is going to be able to create entrepreneurial opportunities some of these people extol and so forth? Or what do you see as the future of communications providing an outlet for our young people or our general creative capabilities of the society in a positive way? Mr. Galbraith says if we don't find something for our people to do, we're going to have to build a lot more prisons and so forth.
Well, we find you know, a rather high level of enthusiasm among students for the field of communications.
All right.
Most communications departments find that they have very, very heavy enrollment. But I would be somewhat careful about treating that as a source of that this will play a positive role in the society. The communications industry, as you know, is, along with all of its other talents, is very, very capable of creating certain types of outlooks, moods, fantasies. I mean, that's what his business is all about.
That's right, yeah.
And so most of these students, at least in an early stage of their studies, have these very unrealistic views of what they will do in communications. Significant numbers of them think they're going to be anchor people.
Yes,
You know,
on
there's
the
only-
network news.
Yeah, there's only, you know, there are
Worldwide,
only about
yeah.
4 anchors
Yes, right.
in the country
Yeah.
of this national promise.
Yeah.
But I mean, so there's this unrealistic thing, and
Yeah.
the field is
Well, that's
hyped.
always part of youth, but yeah.
Yeah, but the
and they
field
got to
is-
be able to dream, you know.
The field is hyped. That's
Yeah.
another aspect
Yeah.
to it. So, as for those who are seriously concerned with looking at what role this industry plays, I'd say that's another matter, and it depends there whether they're lucky enough to find a few teachers who will make some useful observations and point out to them some of the things.
Do you see the communications role? We're talking about the communications, television, but do you see it blending with the film industry and the communications and radio and those kind of things? Are they blending together into one gigantic sort of industry, or what do you see between those two?
Yes, well, I mean, you see that actually in terms of the industrial structures that are being elaborated now, so that if you were to take a company like Disney,
yes,
that's not just a theme park enterprise, which is what Disney originally was. And I would think one has to give a greater deal of attention to such a phenomenon as the theme park in terms of its ideological impact on people. But Disney also is a major movie producer. Disney makes television programs.
Sure.
Disney also, as far as I know, is involved in recordings. So you have, and then of course with its ownership of ABC, you have the whole business of broadcasting and the rest of it.
So
this company, Disney, is an amalgam of all of the areas that we are talking about here. It's not just one sphere of communications, it's the totality of it. And that's why I'm saying this trend toward more and more uniformity comes out even in the kinds of industrial structures that are emerging here.
And the blending of those two things means that very often the news becomes a little softer and it becomes a little more mass-oriented, and it becomes more entertainment, infotainment comes to be more and part of it. And these are all problems that also are magnified by the fact that we're down. Mr. Van Dickian used to recognize, what was it, 40? And it's now down to 10 companies that control 85% of everything that we see, read, hear, and so forth. And this tendency is there, and it's a very worrisome thing. Can you see some countervailing forces to this, or what do we do as citizens or people that are concerned?
Well, I think there are some still very modest countervailing forces. I think the United States has a very large pools of people who want to strike out in new directions, and particularly in this area of communications, so that independent filmmakers, independent movie makers, independent television makers, small presses, all of these abound. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, the internet allows certain kinds of initiatives also, which I wouldn't oversell them, but nevertheless do allow for a certain amount of individual autonomy and expression.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing thing that it came up, the whole microprocessor revolution.
So there are all of these things, and then I constantly have to recognize that even in these very large, what appear to be monolithic cultural, industrial companies, that doesn't mean that everybody in these companies holds the same view as the corporate shareholding community.
Interesting,
You know, so, I mean, you can find people who do the editing, the filming, the recording, almost anything, and they may have a very different set of views. Now, their ability to change the outlooks and the materials and contents that are coming out of these huge companies that they work for, that's another story. But the point to keep in mind, though, is that there are large numbers of people in this country who, if given the opportunity, if given the chance, could very easily try to produce an alternative kind of content, an alternative kind of creative work. And I think that's at least somewhat of a hopeful factor.
Yeah, it usually is the creative forces fighting against. I don't want to say David and Goliath, but very often the creative forces are, in a certain sense, Marshall McLuhan used to note, or other poets noted, that it's like the fish swimming in the water can't really see the water so well, so the artist is, in a certain sense, outside the fishbowl, and that creative process is outside the system. So people, in a certain sense, are marginalized, are very often the most creative ones, if there can be some way for them to get some traction, to get something going, and not let them be just wiped out, which some people say they could be done by commercial forces. And Lord knows it's a tough go now for independent developers of product and other kinds of activities not internet and independent efforts notwithstanding, don't you think?
Yes.
Yeah.
Of course, these large-scale outfits are not entirely able to dispense with some of the independence and some of the creative mavericks. They use them. They need them because that's where some of the most useful new expressions come from, you see. And
Well,
so
they will try and hire them if they can.
They would
and
try
co-opt
if they can, or at least to leave them there. But so there's always that kind of attention too.
Yeah.
And I mean, and it does allow, at least temporarily, a little counter space to exist. So I think basically I'm fishing to be optimistic.
Yes.
I don't know if one can build a very solid case that the resistant forces at this particular time are moving in a way to seriously challenge these kinds of tendencies we've been talking about.
Yeah, and you got these other tendencies which are firmly able to be seen on the radar screen clearly without any problem.
No doubt
These,
about that.
These pressures of concentration and in a certain sense, disquieting sense, they're anti-democratic and they're anti-involvement, and they are creating a certain kind of, among a number of you, a certain kind of, I don't know, free-floating angst, or even onto almost close like alienation and so forth, that might not be immediately seen by some people who seem to be comfortable the way things are. But there are maybe stirrings there in terms of, you know, that might be more meaningful politically, economically, and socially than we might think. So it's a feisty time, an interesting time. You do say, as you say, you're fishing to be optimistic, and you've been working on these. We're here in Cape. Maybe you could just make it, if you could, a moment address. We have the democratic aspects of the internet that is there, and there's some people say we're going to be able to start within a couple of years, start being able to stream and these kind of things with video and sound and so forth. It'll become a broader dimension. We have the miracle of the microprocessor and communications that's going on and so forth. We also have a longer term thing in this cable access where you and I are talking now. I mean,
yes.
Here we've had this since, I don't know,
the 70s, no?
Yeah, early 70s, maybe where it got started, and it's around the country. There's some of that. You've had your eye on that, and this in a certain sense is in a way similar to the democratic aspects of the internet. What do you think about cable access, and do you think there's a future role for it beyond what it's had, or just wonder if you might be able to comment on it?
Well, I think cable access came out of some very strong democratic impulses back at the end of the 60s and the early 70s. And I think it was a very, very fruitful kind of initiative, an imaginative initiative. And I think it's this kind of thing that has to be sought after in our current and into the future period. And I think cable access, just to take one example of it, is something that should have an extended and a much more varied life. I don't see why it should be limited and kept into some kind of a very sequestered corral.
Yeah.
I think social movements should recognize the significance of cable access, and I've seen some occasions where that's been the case, but not as much as it should be.
Well, when you have a communications industry where you have boards of editors and you got all the PR kinds of skills of being able to give soft images and mold the psychology of people and so forth, there's some people there, particularly with their editorial boards and that kind of thing, who might think the idea of, just as some people scoff at the democratic aspect of internet where anybody can put something on there. Well, if anybody can do it, as is the case with cable access, it must not be very good if anyone can do it. So there's this idea of communications being open to anyone in a certain sense rather than to a selected few or something, is something that many people are uncomfortable with. But as these threats to the democratic process and so forth and the lack of involvement of people become greater, there might be more people, not only people within communications, but just people who are aware and in a responsible position for the society in the whole, who might want to see the importance of a democratic expression and the importance of that in sociological and political terms as well, and pick up and back the idea of cable access more than perhaps the people in the general society have. I agree with you. I think some of the decision leaders and thought leaders and so forth might get behind the notion of cable access, just as they can get behind the notion of a democratic expression on the internet.
And then also, you see, I think that an awful lot of the production values, that term that they use to say, you know, high television production values or special print and photographic production values, well, up to a point, one can agree that it certainly does make the message a lot more either persuasive or compelling.
Or artistic in so many cases, yeah.
But it can also be a deterrent to thought and to analysis. It becomes just some sort of a visual tantalization or something of that kind. And I think that's one of the great difficulties that, let's say, working in cable access has and other types of independent work, that you're almost constantly forced to try to compete with this type of standard. And it's not as if it means that you're going to be improving your production. It just means that it makes it that much more difficult to even carry it on in terms of the costs that's involved and what have you.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that's at a certain point going to have to be dealt with in the whole society, the whole question even of aesthetics and form and quality.
Yeah, yeah, well, it could be, and I can't help thinking that, you know, as we get to be where there's going to be the expression of people who are able to, this is non-commercial here, and there's a realm, the whole world is trying to take every single human emotion they possibly can, commoditize it and sell that on the market and so forth. There's going to be a place for the expression of the human spirit that is not commoditized, and that there's going to be there's going to be increased need of that, whether it's here, community theater, other kinds of things. There's going to be new venues for the expression of the human spirit that aren't in the commercial commoditization
I think so.
process, and access is an important part of that.
If the human spirit is to survive,
yes,
that's absolutely so.
Right.
But I also concur, you know, totally, that every area, every nook, every cranny of our social space is being preempted by this commercial message.
It's a horror. If nothing else, access ought to be there to point out the horror of what's going on in other parts of the world as we do it. Well, in any case, I really do thank you very, very much for all your work over the years, sir.
Thank you very much
for that. And I remind you, in the cable audience, we'll run out of time, I'm sorry here, but we've had the perceptions of Dr. Herbert Schiller. He's at the Department of Emeritus now, Department of Communication at University of California, San Diego. He's also connected here with New York University. Thank you very much for coming in. We invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for this particular segment. Dr. Herbert Schiller, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Until next time. So we're just running. So it goes on and on. I'm glad we were able to do that. I don't know, it'll air probably in a couple of weeks now, you know, in New York. Is that a Hamilton?
It was. You see, it was my father's watch, but it was stolen. They left it on the beach in a shoe, and somebody took it. So then it's sort of a replica of it.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Was it Hamilton?
Yeah, originally it was.
Yeah, we had that in our family. It was just odd. We used to have the Hamilton. I used to have a watch like that. My father had, yeah.
But I now use it. Well, I've gotten accustomed to it, and I don't particularly like a wristwatch.
Yeah.
But I notice when I take it out, I use it and put it in front of my desk or so.
Right.
You know, the students look at me. Well, what kind of a character is this? you know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I like them, but.
So how much longer do you have in New York before you go back?
I leave on Sunday.
On Sunday.